sports, one of the things, our assumption that men have an advantage over women, right? In sports. In sports, yeah.
Our assumption?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let me expand on it. Our assumption that men have an advantage over women in sports is partially based on the fact that so many of the sports were designed for male bodies, right? They're optimized for male bodies, right? Basketball, for example, right?
How is that optimized for male bodies?
It's like the height of the basket, the way that the ball moves around, if
the ball moves around.
If we're gonna say that, if we're gonna say that the entire system of male versus female sports is prejudiced, and we should demolish the whole thing and come up with a system of sports that everybody can participate in, because sports are just a part of life.
People will say that that's like discriminatory towards women, though, because then it's like, because all men will always dominate. That co-ed sport,
They
because
won't
like
if you
because of
develop
the
sports.
averages, because of like I get it. I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Take soccer, right? How would you adjust the rules of soccer very slightly in order to make it, build more gender parity into soccer? You could do it. We made the sports up. I know, but there's so much, there's so much tradition that people will refuse to do that. They'll say you're trying to game the system in a way that it's worse. The outcomes are worse overall because co-ed automatically means worse, because as it stands currently, co-ed is worse. And I try to get him to look at it with a bigger picture and say hey man, sports are social constructions. We made them up. We designed sports such that the most popular ones are designed for a male body. What if we didn't do that? What if women's gymnastics, men can't do that shit, right? Because there's etc. What if we invented sports that we did not have a problem with, right? Because sports is just a fun thing to do. Sports is something that everyone should be able to participate in. So what if we invented some less gendered sports? He was not willing to entertain that conversation. He was I was like, is this not interesting? And he wouldn't go there with.
So if you're a woman and you're a natural woman and you don't take any extra hormones or male hormones, you're not taking steroids or any sort of performance-enhancing drugs, you're doing your very best to compete and you're at the top of the heap, but then someone comes along that was a man for 30 years and decides that they're going to be a woman, and this has happened, and literally transitioned a few months ago, and competes as a woman and destroys records and dominates you in that sport. That's bullshit. And that's not competing on a level playing field. That's a person who's biologically a male and who is a male for 30 plus years of having testosterone run through their body and affect their tendon strength and affect the shape of their bones and the mechanical advantages of the male hips versus the female hips. And then they're competing with smaller people who have been a woman their whole life. It's not fair. It's as much cheating as taking steroids when the other person doesn't, or taking performance-enhancing drugs when the other person doesn't, maybe even more so. Maybe even more so because you also there's a bunch of advantages in terms of reaction time that males enjoy. It's some significant difference in reaction time between males and even untrained males versus female professional athletes.
Well, I disagree, and
what do you disagree about?
I've already my main point being the one that I already made, right? That I don't think that there is such a thing as a perfectly level playing field. I think we decide what kind of playing field we want to have.
Sure, but we do make the distinction where we don't allow men to compete in women's divisions.
And I think that distinction may be breaking down a bit, right? And I think it may be time to break down that distinction a little bit.
So you think that males should be able to compete in the women's division of weightlifting?
No, I don't necessarily.
But they can if they transition.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff to break down, right? And I'm not an expert on the subject, right? So it's just sort of off the top of my head. Again, I'm not an expert on this, and I'd love to. This is the kind of topic where I really want to make sure that I know the research and that I'm, also speaking to trans folks, in this conversation. But so to touch on just what I have a friend who has a trans kid. Don't know the kid's exact age, but we're in the age range that we're talking about. And he's explained that my child from a very young age consistently said, I am a girl. like, and has never contradicted themselves, never changed their mind. And so the humane thing and the thing that he felt was good to do as a parent was to like embrace that choice on his child's part, right?
But if that's who they are, if they think that they're a girl, why do you have to give them hormones to make them more of a girl?
Because I'm sorry, can you expand on the question?
It's a simple question. If you say that the child thinks it's a girl, so you're going to give the child hormones.
So what trans people express, and again, I'm not an expert. This is from me talking to my trans friends and you know, seeing what other trans folks say. Look, so all I can do is defer to the experts that I know about this, right? So, you know, for instance, there's an author named Bryn Tannehill, who's a former military helicopter pilot. I just interviewed her for my new podcast. So look, I know quite a few trans folks, right? Mm-hmm. I do know also among the trans folks that I know, or the trans people who speak about this that I've heard. I'm very curious, and this is what I'd go consult my friend or my recent interview subject, Bryn Tannehill's work on this to see how many. But I would really one of the I've sort of reached the limit of like my facility with this topic. Mm-hmm. I really want to shout out videos made by a friend of mine. Her videos are called ContraPoints. Her name's Natalie Wynn, and she does these. She's a former philosopher, former philosophy PhD, mm-hmm. and she does these incredibly funny videos. When we're talking about an issue that affects those people, right? The first thing we should do is listen to those people. When we talk to the actual trans folks, right, and talk to, you know, say, hey, what do you think? You know, how do you feel?
But we also have a different conversation. We talk to people that have regret from transition surgery, because there's a lot of those.
Sure, but we don't have either of those folks in the room.
Right,
but
we have to acknowledge that they're real as well.
Look, the last conversation I had with a person about this was a trans military veteran who mm-hmm. is a researcher who wrote a book on these issues, right? Comprehensively looked at the research and told me that the research shows that the evidence that you're asking for exists, maybe not on a 30-year timeline, but there have been studies of this, and here's what we know about them, right?
About children transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, that is my understanding of I have not looked at the research myself. You know, including those folks in this conversation is a really critical part of it for me.
Sure.
So yeah.
10 million. I mean, how many people are trans? What's the numbers on that?
You know, I don't know, but I would consult my friend Bryn's book to find out, because I'm sure it's in there, because she wrote a book that breaks down all these statistics called
"This is such
Everything You Need to Know About Trans."
Minefield of a subject,
and I'm not an expert on that, and I don't want to claim to be, right?
Yeah, so he was just stuck in this loop, and you know, most of the podcast he just sounded so confused.
Way more women involved in gymnastics than men.
Oh, absolutely. But those are the sports that get the less attention, right?
Gymnastics
and we have
gets huge amounts of attention.
It sure does. It's one of the rare examples of like, and people were saying about this guy that his prosthetic gave him an advantage. Now, first of all, there's no fucking way that's true, because he doesn't have muscles. Muscles
but
convert
I actually
food
think
into.
It does give you an advantage. I mean,
you do think so?
I think mechanically it does, because they're springs. They essentially, the way his leg works with those things.
Hold on a second. That's not an advantage, because how mechanics work, right, is that a spring, you put energy into it and you get a little bit less energy out, right? So because that's the laws of thermodynamics, right? You can't get more out than you put in. Oh, this is one of my favorite videos we ever did. So, you know, it's about how the moon land. The thesis is the moon landing could not have been faked. It would have been harder to fake the moon landing than it would have been to actually go to the moon, because the technology to fake it did not exist. Like, and we talked to a forensic film guy, and he walked us through it. He's like, look, the shadows are parallel, right? They're not diverging. You know, a close light source, the shadows would diverge, right? So
wait a minute. You know that's like one of the big arguments for the moon hoax, is that the shadows intersect. The shadows indicate multiple light sources.
Well, that is because but
that's one of the main arguments.
That is I believe that's reflected light. Okay, I'm getting past my memory of this segment.
Yeah, dude, I used to be a full-on moon hoaxer. I fully believed we never went to the moon.
I shouldn't have brought this up.
I watched the documentary that was on Fox TV while I was on news radio. It's like
most of the games that we've constructed are actually sort of biased towards a male type of body, right?
That sounds ridiculous. First of all, the reason why
I was excited to do this interview, because at the time Joe was not so directly associated with like the far right. Like he hadn't totally made that turn yet. All right, I mean, I'll go to bat for what I think is right here as best I can, but you know, when the dude is like locked and loaded with like, you know, Jamie pull that up shit of whatever pseudoscience he wants to bring up, it wasn't the best position to be in. And you know, so that's my biggest bummer about it was like he was not really into the idea of having like an honest, he turned it immediately into a boxing match, and I wanted to have a conversation. So all the backlash was like, oh, Rogan owned you. He won a debate against you. I was like, I thought I was having a conversation. Like,
Yeah.
I thought I went on to just like talk about my show, and like, and he turned it into a fist fight, which that's what I don't like about it.